Elizabeth Newt. Okay, and I am joined by my coworker, Elizabeth Knudsen, who covers the West Potomac Pyramid. She always loves for me to say that she's my absolute favorite coworker. Sometimes she threatens me to say it, but she actually is my favorite coworker, which is why I enjoy doing these presentations with her. So we are going to dive into why people behave and respond the way that they do and how we can support one another as a community. So like I said, feel free to drop down in the chat box if you have any questions. So this presentation will cover a range of topics that includes neuroscience, epigenetics, ACEs, and then resilience. So ACEs stands for adverse childhood experiences. So my hope is you'll see some connections that will help you understand not only yourself, but your children and other people. I like to say that my goal for this presentation is to get us to be a little bit more gracious to other people because we're all going through things. So this will help you understand how people are going through things and attempting to manage those things that they're going through. So first I'm going
screen.
Oh crap, I've been talking this whole time and you all couldn't see my screen.
Yeah.
Thanks, Elizabeth. That's why you're my fave.
No problem.
1 second. Why can I not find the button all of a sudden? Oh.
See it at the bottom, it says share screen in green. Do you see it near the bottom?
There we go. Thank you. Can you see the screen where it says early adversity increases physical, mental, behavioral problems, scientists report?
Yep, it's up.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to share some of the findings from the study. The ACE study confirms with scientific evidence that adversity early in life increases physical, mental, and behavioral problems later in life. It's the largest study of its kind, which is why it's super interesting to me because it has over 17,000 study participants and they actually continue to track those people today. So it was developed and then co-sponsored by Kaiser Permanente in San Diego and the CDC. In Atlanta, Georgia, and they started the study in the early 90s. So they're going on 30 plus years of working on this study. So you have Dr. Anda on the left and then Dr. Filiti on the right. So Dr. Filiti was actually studying obesity and Dr. Anda is a cardiologist and they are the co-principal investigators for this study. So a little background is that they developed this study because when they were studying obesity, they noticed that a lot of the patients that they were working with were losing weight with the programs that they put them on, but then randomly they began to gain the weight back. So the classic person who I like to talk about is Jan. So Jan is a woman who was working with Dr. Filiti and she was losing the weight. And he was like, okay, congratulations. And then some weeks later, when she came back to see him, she gained all of the weight back. And I'm talking like 30, 40, 50 pounds. And he was like, what's going on? So come to find out, when she lost the weight, she began getting unwanted attention from men. So her background was that Jan had been sexually abused as a child. And she felt that if she added on more weight, then she would no longer get the attention. And then that led to various other studies. And some research has also shown that a large proportion of people who are overweight have experienced some type of abuse in childhood. So when you look at this picture right here, it's a very simple depiction of the human central nervous system. So the central nervous system consists of the brain and the spinal cord, and then they integrate all of our senses to process information. It regulates our internal body functions, the things that we don't have to think about, like breathing, our heart beating, and things like that. And it works to send signals throughout our body. So all of this is important because we'll see and recognize how our body is affected by stress and adversity. So the nervous system takes in the sensory information from the world around us every second, and then determines our understanding of and how we will respond to the world we live in, because we're constantly taking in information and then responding. So our bodies are quite extraordinary while functioning similar to, yet better than computers. So the cells in the nervous system are called neurons, and then they are pretty incredible because they process and transmit information. They have just one central purpose, and that's really just to keep us alive. So when you look at this picture right here, this is an example of synaptic density. So we're going to look at 3 different stages of development. So you see at birth, elementary, and then puberty. So on the far left, we see a set of brain cells or neurons and what they might look like at birth. There aren't many connections between these cells at birth because babies are born with only the connections and brain functions they need at that point in life. Like all they're doing is peeing, pooping, and crying. They don't need all of these extra processes going on. They're not processing life and the subtle nuances of death and all of these other heavy topics. But then at elementary age, you have more neurons in the brain. So that's why people say if you're trying to teach a child a new language, it's best to teach them when they're little because they're like sponges. They're going to soak up all of that information. But what I want you to remember is that not only are they soaking up the good information, but they're also soaking up the bad information. So then over time, our brains are so smart. What it does is it tries to condense the information so that it can function more rapidly. So our brain kind of works like an iPhone. So when you first get your iPhone, there's not many programs on it. It's just the apps that come on the phone. Then we start adding all of these things. We have all our Brazilian pictures from 10 years ago of our cute little kid that we don't want to delete. We have all of these iMessages coming through. Then your phone starts moving slowly after a year and a half. So then you're like, oh crap, let me delete some of these apps that I don't really use. So then you start deleting apps and then your phone functions a little bit more faster. So that's how our brain works as well. So that's what you see going on in puberty is some of those things that we don't use gets erased. Like I took Spanish from 6th grade through college. I can get by, but I'm not fluent like I should be. And that's because I'm not in a country where I constantly have to speak Spanish. So when you look at this picture, this is showing 2 different paths of life. So you have one on the top that would be considered a malevolent or dangerous world. And then on the bottom, you have one that would be considered the benevolent or safe world. So if you're imagining a child growing up, typically they might fall within 1 or 2 of these pathways. So traumatic experience during development, like abuse, neglect, and chaotic relationships, generates predictable patterns of brain architecture, behavior, and traits. Because you have to learn how to function in these 2 different types of environments. So humans are actually only made to be under stress for about 20 minutes at a time, which is just enough time to figure out if I'm going to fight, flight, or freeze. But when you have children who grow up in environments who are constantly experiencing abuse, neglect, or even being in a war zone, that has a big impact on development. And then, hey, I mean, we're looking at a global pandemic on top of that as well. So with those circumstances, the brain will develop in a way to prepare itself for a dangerous world. So when we talk about stress, something to remember is that we have stress hormones called cortisol in our body. So when you constantly have that flood of cortisol hanging around in the body, the person who grows up in that dangerous world, they might be edgy, hot-tempered, impulsive, hypervigilant, withdrawn, dissociated, or numb. So that would be the path that you see at the top, living in the dangerous world. But then you have the pathway on the bottom, and that's a person who grows up in a relatively safe environment with low levels of cortisol. So they might be a little bit more focused. They might be able to sit still in class and things like that. So now when you think about those 2 children who grow up and then become adults, you have to consider what type of world they grew up in. So what kind of situations might be a good match for a person who tends to be edgy, hypervigilant, emotionally detached, or quick to act? You can drop some of the jobs in the chat box. I think that obvious is the one that's on the screen, right? So someone who is hyper vigilant and edgy, like they make for a good firefighter. Like you have to be quick on your toes. Yes, police, correctional workers, all of that. And let's also talk about, soldiers, definitely. Definitely. And also mental health professionals sometimes. They say that a lot of times the people who work in environments where they are helping others, they do that because they feel like they might have needed help when they were younger. And I'm going to pass it off to Elizabeth for a few.
All right. So Tiffany's been talking about the biology that happens and how our brain changes with our experience. And so the problem is when our biology or our biological adaptations that, we've gained through that experience, when it collides with social expectations, that's when we run into trouble. So it really makes me think about my husband and his coworker. So my husband, love him dearly. He is extremely detail oriented. He's super methodical and analytical. I mean, y'all try and go buy some furniture from IKEA with this man. I mean, he's like going through the different options like that I didn't even know they had. But anyway, that serves him really, really well in his job. Now, he has a coworker who has served multiple tours of duty in Afghanistan and Iraq. And his coworker has really struggled over the years with detail, and he doesn't really see the point of all the red tape that their job often entails. And, it seems like really long processes that they have to go through. So I can see where his coworkers, the expectations of his job versus his hardwired responses or his adaptations really kind of make things more difficult for him. But what I want people to know and understand is that he has slowly adapted and started to develop skills so that he can be successful in his job. And that really is my point, is that yes, you have all of these experiences that shape your brain, but we can also create experiences for people where they develop the skills that they need to be successful. It's going to take time. It's not going to happen immediately. So being able to understand that our biology is hardwired into our DNA by experience, and that some people's experiences and responses to stress are adapted better to some situations than others, it might help us understand our kids or our kids' friends or other people in our lives who are edgy and hypervigilant, and maybe they're reluctant to engage with us. Maybe we can understand them in a different way if we think about it, if we shift our thinking. And so Tiffany was talking earlier about, some children, come to school and we ask them to sit still and we ask them to cooperate with others. That can be a really painful disconnect if they're coming from that malevolent world. So some of these children are going to have to be actively taught the skills to help them succeed in school, to help them succeed in whatever context that they're trying to be successful in. So it may not be that kids are being defiant or spiteful, but it may be that they're showing an adaptation for the environment that they've grown up in. And their behavior really is coming from a deeper place like survival. Oopsie. So this slide is really just saying that there are different times in the brain when important things are happening, and we call those sensitive periods. And so there are different sensitive periods for all the different brain regions. So the brain typically develops from the back to the front and from the inside out. So that's one of the easier ways of explaining it. But during these sensitive periods, those are times when the functional abilities and the growth of that region are most affected by experience, and so therefore are most vulnerable to toxic stress. So I talk a lot with students about the hippocampus. It's a memory center, because proper development of the hippocampus during adolescence is absolutely crucial for memory and learning. And so I'm the drug lady. So if I'm talking to them about alcohol, I'm talking about like, if you're pouring alcohol on your hippocampus, then it is not going to develop in the way that it needs to. And that's kind of similar for toxic stress. If you got toxic stress and then you got somebody who also is drinking, it's like a double whammy on that area of the brain. So just remember that the brain is kind of like building blocks or algebra. So we have all these like new abilities, but they have to build and grow from the development from earlier months and years. Over time, our brains are so incredible and they develop these very specialized regions and very elaborate systems that help us navigate really complex environments. Next slide. Okay. So far we've talked a lot about the brain, and we talked about how it develops based on experience. And so we interpret the world through the lens of our experiences. Hopefully that makes sense. So that lens is really going to impact how we respond to our environment. So our nervous system is rehearsing for the environment that we've grown up in and day out. So based on our experiences, stress may be interpreted by the brain as something that we can tolerate and work through, or it may be interpreted as something that's really overwhelming. So our set points for stress interpretation are pretty much in place by early adulthood, because we know that the brain pretty much is finished developing by 25. So toxic stress in early childhood has really profound effects on brain structures and functions that develop later in childhood. So it could be something that happened early on, doesn't show up until later on. So those functions can include being able to regulate emotions, being able to interact with other people, abstract thinking. And so that's why when we talk about early childhood being so important, it's absolutely true. But there are other sensitive developmental periods other than early childhood. So 7 to 13, huge sensitive developmental period because of a lot of things that Tiffany was talking about earlier with all the pruning and things that are going on with the brain cells. Okay. Next. So we're going to start to get into the A study a little bit deeper in just a minute. But I just want to wrap up just by reminding that we've talked about sensitive developmental periods, and we've talked about the toxic stress that, that has such a profound effect on the development of the brain. But what I also want you to hear is that these childhood times, so early childhood, 7 to 13, those are also windows of opportunity for building resilience. Because although, the brain is sensitive to bad experiences, it's also sensitive to good experiences. So we as parents or as educators can help create some of those experiences that build resilience. So by paying attention to those really sensitive developmental periods, we can do a better job of protecting kids and providing the kinds of challenges and opportunities that may help remediate earlier periods of toxic stress and basically help them find ways of having a sense of well-being. So we have a choice. We can help kids actively develop the skills that they need to enable them to contribute to our community, or we can reject kids or people when they have normal and adaptive responses to childhood adversity. But remember, those adaptive responses might collide with our expectations. So we might have to shift and start thinking of it a different way. So if you remember only one thing from all of this about brain development, I hope you'll remember that toxic stress can be hardwired into biology. So before we assume that a person's behaviors are like rebellion, let's think about the possibility that adversity might be what we're seeing. So now we're going to switch gears and dive a little bit deeper into the ACE study that Tiffany mentioned earlier. Tiffany, you're on mute.
Wow, like we're 2 years into the pandemic, like I should know to unmute myself. But this is the meat and potatoes of the actual ACE study. So if you can be a little bit of a nerd like me when it comes to science and data, social sciences, then this will be really interesting to you. So far, Elizabeth and I have explained the effects of toxic stress on individuals, but we have to remember that individuals affect the population. So let's take a look at how toxic stress affects the whole population. So this is where epidemiologists come in and they study the origins of disease, disability, productivity, and health in a population. So epidemiologists measure incidence and distribution to possibly control a problem. So now we're going to dive into the largest epidemiological study of its kind, which is the ACE study. And this is so important because I think that depending on where you are spiritually, emotionally, and culturally, in America, we tend to function in like our separate silos. We're very individualistic. And the ACE study takes the individual and looks at how they affect everyone in the population. So if anything, this should be a reason for you to care. So the ACE study, some of the strengths of the study is that it's a gateway to empathy and compassion. So that is my personal goal for you all here today, is to walk away with, like I said, being able to extend grace to other people. However, some of the weaknesses of the study is that it doesn't measure intensity, frequency, and chronicity. So all of the ACE scores aren't created equally, and I'll dive into that a little bit later. So most studies only research one type of child abuse at a time, whereas the ACE study actually looks at ACEs as a whole instead of in its separate silos. So the ACE study broadened the picture to include multiple types of childhood stressors. So this is what makes the ACE study pretty unique, because it provides the potential to understand how multiple forms of childhood stressors can affect many important public health problems. Because we know that when a child experiences one type of abuse or neglect, they're more than likely going to experience another type of abuse or neglect or some other adversity in their life. So the design of the ACE study began in 91. But then in 1994, that's when the CDC got their hands in it. So like I said, more than 17,000 people participated through Kaiser Permanente insurance. And then what they did was they gave a survey to those 17,000 people, and they looked at the incident rates of health behavior, some of their disease risk, mental health and substance abuse issues, and etc. So the study participants range from 19 to 94 years old. And something to keep in mind is that the people who participated in the study, they were mainly, and when I say mainly, I mean 80% white middle class participants with access to some of the best healthcare in the world. And only 6% of them did not have a high school diploma. So I want you to remember that when we get to this slide. So this is what the 10 ACEs are. When you look at adversity, for the ACE study, this is what they're measuring. They're measuring 10 of these things. So each one of these counts as a point, if you will. So you have the category of household dysfunction, then another of neglect, and then abuse. So the way that you configure or come up with your ACE score is before the age of 18, did you live in a household with someone who abused substances? If the answer is yes, then you check 1. So remember how I said the ACE study doesn't take into fact chronicity and intensity, because when you go over to abuse, have you ever experienced sexual abuse prior to the age of 18? Even if it happened one time, it's just a 1. Or if it happened multiple times for multiple years of that person's life, then it's still a score of 1. So you'll see the 10 ACEs there. So it includes substance abuse, parental separation, or divorce. And something to remember is that divorce is easier for a child to, death is a little bit easier for a child to process than if a parent just is completely absent and chose not to be in the child's life. So then you have growing up in a household with someone who experienced a mental illness, and then excuse the old language that says battered mothers, but they are specifically looking at domestic violence against the woman in the household. And then also criminal behavior, meaning someone who has gone to jail or prison within their household. And then the 2 types of neglect, emotional and physical, and then the 3 different types of abuse, emotional, physical, or sexual. So the percentages that you see next to each of those is how common those ACEs are. Something to remember is that this is not an exhaustive list of every single negative experience that a child can survive and endure, but these are just 10 of the most prevalent ones that seem to have the largest impact on our society. So something to also remember is that what the study found was that where there is 1 ACE, so 1 thing out of the 10 that someone has gone through, there's a likely chance, actually an 87% chance, that there is another. So we'll see that here. So when you look at this depiction here, you'll see that only 33% of the population has 0 ACEs. So that means that 66% of people in our country are walking around with ACEs. So what I have come to visualize when I'm talking about ACEs and trying to extend grace to people is that we're all constantly walking around with like this invisible knapsack, this invisible book bag. And the invisible book bag contains all of the ACEs that we have experienced, plus the other crap that we have gone through in life. So 66% of people in our country have those ACEs in their book bag. Only 33% of people don't. And then you have 16% of our population that has 4 or more. So something to consider is that this would be like a stress dose response relationship. So essentially, the higher the ACE score, the higher the developmental effects of toxic stress on that individual. So there's a positive correlation between ACE score and the number of people with health and social problems. So you'll see on the graph, the higher the ACE score goes up, the more health problems a person tends to have. And it kind of functions like the temperature of heat, right? So when the stove is hot and you burn your hand on the stove, however hot that that stove was will determine the degree of burn. So then with this graph, you'll see that from left to right in the graph, we have a correlation between a person smoking early in age with a high ACE score. So the higher the ACE score, the more likely someone is to begin smoking earlier in life. So this is something to consider, like for the admin who are watching and listening to this presentation. Like when you have a kid who's vaping and then you're constantly catching them vaping in the bathroom, it's not just that they don't listen and they're not following the school rules, but what else might be going on in their life that they're having difficulty processing. So when you look at this graph, you see the same is true for people who currently smoke and for people who have COPD. So something to remember is that people don't smoke simply because they don't know the risk of smoking, right? Like they have done a very good job with ads and commercials letting us know that smoking causes cancer, heart disease, emphysema, and all of these other things, right? because we know that after the tobacco industry faced RICO charges, which are federal charges usually reserved for mobsters for misleading the public with their campaigns, warning labels were then placed on nicotine products in 1966. So for the past almost 50 years, we have known how problematic cigarettes and smoking is. So the question isn't necessarily, why won't that person just stop? But the question here is, what's the story that's connected to the choices that people continue to make? So like in my work as a substance abuse therapist, like I've treated like so many people who have had drug addictions and so on and so forth, and they rightfully so wanted to give up cocaine, heroin, alcohol, and all those other drugs and substances that cause a lot of harm in their life. But in most cases, the most difficult thing for them to give up was the cigarettes. So the question to ask yourself is, was it because they started smoking so young, so it became a way of life ingrained in every single activity? Or was it because they were losing everything else that brought them comfort and they couldn't bear the thought of not having at least one thing that could bring them immediate comfort and relief? So at that point, smoking just becomes an adaptive behavior. And I am going to power through some of these graphs, but this is just looking at the percentage of people who have a high ACE score and then also end up developing an alcohol use disorder and or end up marrying someone who has an alcohol problem. So in this chart, you'll see that the risk of having an alcohol problem increases 6 times when an ACE score goes from 0 to 6. And then here you see the same with ACEs and depression. So we know that depression is the leading cause of disability in developed countries. Go America. The risk of depression increases with the higher ACE score someone has, and that's because the body keeps the score. Depression doesn't just live in the mind. It's not just a psychological problem, but your body tends to hold all of that stress from that cortisol. So here we're going to take a look at a list of ACE attributable problems. So what that means is that when someone has an ACE score or they have ACEs, this list are some of the problems that can be linked back to their ACEs. And that's because the stress within the body increases over time, producing more cortisol. So you'll see like even workplace problems, unintended pregnancies, fetal death, intimate partner violence, and so on. So ACEs are common, they're interrelated, and they have a cumulative impact on us all. So people with higher ACE scores are more likely to have multiple health and social problems, then increasing the possibility of having a high ACE score. And something to also remember is that we know that birds of a feather flock together, right? So when someone has a high ACE score, they usually end up partnering, marrying, having children with someone else who has a high ACE score. Then they come together, they make that baby, and then the cycle continues. So when you look at this chart here, this is called an oil slick slide, and it's really because where there's one ACE, there's another, and when there's one issue, there tends to be another. So when you look at this graph, like if you look at the bottom where it says 65% alcoholism, this graph shows us that approximately 65% of people who have an alcohol problem, it's due to their ACEs. 33% of people who binge drink, it's because of their ACEs. There's another stat that showed that 24% of cardiovascular disease is due to ACEs, 40% of recent depression due to ACEs. And I'll pass it on to Elizabeth.
All right. I'm sorry I'm not turning on my camera, but I look blue and I just can't bear it. So thank you for going over all of those graphs, Tiffany. I'm so glad I didn't have to do that part. So the ACE study is awesome though, and it's so interesting because it really provides very straightforward information about the consequences of toxic stress during childhood. And with scientific research, it gives us really powerful information that we can use every day to improve health and safety and prosperity of our communities. But the ACE study isn't a detailed roadmap of services or programs. So it's a lot of things, but it doesn't tell us what programs necessarily. So now that you've heard all this information, you might be wondering, okay, well, what can I do and how do I respond? Like, what's the next step? And so as parents and as educators, we have the opportunity to help lead the way. We have the power to help shift the dynamics that lead to high ACE scores. So we can help the kids in our schools and in our community and in our families in a positive way that hopefully reduces the effects of toxic stress. So I'm not even talking about like huge things that we have to do, but it's small things that can shift the dynamics. Like, you know, noticing a student or your child and like something really positive that they've done and having those positive interactions. But through our collective knowledge, talents, and actions, we can help shift the dynamics within our own families and schools and communities. Oh, next slide, Tiffany. Okay. Okay. So when people hear about the ACE study findings, they often ask about resilience, and people get really excited about the idea of resilience. And I think that's partly because we're reminded that our supportive actions matter. What we do matters. And so our desire for resilience sometimes leads us to look for ways to help our families and communities build that. And so there are 3 protective systems that interact and guide positive adaptation. And those systems are individual capabilities, attachment and belonging with caring and competent people, and protective community, faith, and cultural processes. So, what do we know about people who do well despite adversity? We know that those 3 protective systems that I just mentioned are nested. So, people do best when they are living in thriving families and communities. So, we can help one another develop those personal attributes that will help us weather life's storms. And those personal attributes are things like positive view of one's life, self-efficacy, self or emotion regulation. Those are all things that are discussed at length in the resilience literature. So in Fairfax County, we know this is true because year after year, the youth survey, the Fairfax County Youth Survey, I'm sure y'all are familiar with it, it demonstrates that children need 3 protective factors to help increase their chances of success. So Fairfax County calls this 3 to succeed. So what you should take away from this is that what you do and how you help your kids, it really matters. It matters so much. Next slide. Okay. So positive view of one's life or oneself, it's just, you know, a characteristic. It lets me know that I'm important and valuable. It's also useful because it helps a person ask for help when they need it. And what's probably not really surprising to y'all, but is really important to know, is that a positive view is closely related to hope. So together, it helps me not give up. So positive view is also about the story we tell ourselves that says good things are going to happen to me or good things do happen to me. So when we notice the core gifts of kids that we interact with, people that we interact with, and we help them find opportunities to give those gifts to the community that they live in and care about, we're helping generate positive view and hope in that student or in our child. Really reminds me of my nephew JT. He has a teacher that I'm not even sure why, because he wasn't especially musical, but he has a teacher that got him connected with the band. So JT, love his little heart, had tried literally everything. Like he had tried swimming, he had tried lacrosse, he had tried football, he had tried baseball, and he felt upset because like he just didn't love sports. and I think it bothered him because my brother like is a sports dude, but the band really has changed things for him. He has found his niche. Like he's playing a couple of different instruments. He has a group of friends. He, started to high school already as a member of the band, and he is just like totally thriving. Like it's not even phased him that he's, gone to high school, and it's just amazing. So, be recognizing that, a kid needs a place to be or has a talent or has a gift, and then encouraging that and helping them develop that helps build resilience, and it helps them deal with, negative things that may be happening in their life. So also another thing to know is that people with positive view and people with hope are more likely to complete at least 1 year of post-high school education. They're less likely to be depressed, and they're more likely to be employed. Next slide. Okay. So self-efficacy, that's really the belief that what I do influences what happens to me. So y'all have probably been building self-efficacy in your kids for forever. I mean, I've got a 3-year-old right now, so I try to build self-efficacy in her, letting her pick out her clothes or letting her, cook with us, or, if my nerves can handle it, like I try to let her do most everything that's possible. But yeah, so we can help build that self-efficacy in our kids. And that's just one of the small things that we can do, so that they know that what they do matters, and they have influence. And I mean, I've got plenty of kids who unfortunately don't think that what they do matters, that they have any control over their lives at all. And that's really dangerous, because if they have that belief, then who are they giving up control to? Or what are they giving up control to? And for me, oftentimes, the kids I work with, they're giving up their control to drugs, or, you know, to their peers who might not have the best thoughts or ideas on good things to do. Okay, sorry, next slide.
Elizabeth, I'm sorry. Are you able to turn on your camera? Our participants are really hoping to see you.
Oh, sure.
And they don't mind you being blue at all.
Okay, all right.
Thank you.
I hate looking like a Smurf, but yes, I'm
You
totally
look great.
fine.
Thank
Okay.
you.
So self-regulation or emotion regulation, that is probably the thing that I talk about the most with students, because it is absolutely vital to their success as a human being. So self-regulation really is our ability to, manage our state of mind and our emotions while we're in different social situations. So sometimes though, when we're like activated, when we're upset about something, we can't, or we don't read a situation and adapt our behavior to it. And so that can make social aspects of life really difficult when we're not able to self-regulate. So there are lots of different strategies for practicing self-regulation, and people can cultivate and practice those, and really develop those so that they'll have them available to them in times of distress. And so we as parents and as educators can like co-regulate. So we work on our own regulation while we're getting them to work on their regulation. So I do this with my child. I help her breathe through things. So, we've been talking about breathing since she was 18 months old. I do it at the same time that she does it. When I'm meeting with kids and they're like upset and activated, like we go through a tapping sequence together, or we go through a progressive muscle relaxation together. So, modeling it and doing it with them is good for everybody involved. Okay, good. So we have really powerful opportunities to create spaces for our kids so that they can experience psychological safety and learn to self-regulate. So that's kind of that co-regulation that I was talking about. So Tiffany mentioned Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. He's a like guru leader in trauma-informed care. And if you haven't read his book, I fully recommend it. I just saw that it was updated on Audible. So it's called The Body Keeps the Score. Excellent book. But anyway, so he talks about that we really need to be thinking about two concurrent priorities. So activating social engagement while also calming the physical sensations or tensions in the body. And so one way to do that can be something as simple as talking and having a conversation while walking. So therapists do this a lot. They walk and talk because the walking and that back and forth motion really helps to calm some of those physical sensations that people are experiencing. But then you're also engaging them in that social aspect that's so important. So sometimes social engagement for people who've grown up in stressful environments where relationships equal danger, social engagement is like real stressful for them. So walking and talking is especially good for them. But there's so many things that we can help people learn to self-regulate. So the simplest and most researched is deep breathing. So like I was saying earlier, I breathe through things with my well, she's not 18 months old anymore, my 3-year-old. And she gets annoyed with me sometimes, but she knows when I'm like, what can we do to calm down? She's like, oh, breathe. So at least I'm developing those neural connections in her brain that she has the ability to calm herself down. She has that self-efficacy to do that. But another strategy is really practicing connection. It's one of the ways that we self-regulate. So that attachment, like, I don't know if y'all have ever experienced like your partner or somebody that you really love, like putting their hand on you when you're like really upset and it helps you calm down, or getting a hug from somebody when you're really upset. That connection really helps with self-regulation. Attachment is like a good, strong attachment to someone is probably one of the best things for self-regulation, honestly. So structuring time for conversations with your child to help them practice connection, like playing games that get them talking, or maybe having a topic of conversation like at the dinner table that everyone can engage in, helps them practice connection and helps them practice that social engagement. Sorry, I could talk about this forever. This is one of my favorite things. Okay, next. So there are lots of individual capabilities that are associated with recovery and resilience, but oftentimes those are the same capabilities that don't develop well when children experience lots of adversity or trauma. But we can embrace the word yet and the power of yet, and instead think, I haven't yet learned that, or they haven't yet learned that. And we can shift our perspective to see it as these children just haven't had the opportunity to develop it yet, but they can. So I just think that that's, kind of a powerful concept. All right, next slide. Okay, so I was talking about attachment earlier, but the second protective system that we really need to nurture is belonging. So people talk about the importance of having people in their lives, people who recognize and encourage their talents and their interests and strengths. But it's not just having people in your lives. What's important is relationships with caring and competent people. So not just having a bunch of friends, but having people who are like really there for you. And that is absolutely vital to somebody's resilience. So competency typically requires that somebody helps people learn new skills. They practice psychological safety. So just really people who are there digging into the nitty-gritty with them. So for people who have difficulty with emotion regulation, picking up on social cues, um, problems with addiction and family bonds, and other, consequences from developmental trauma, that can mean that they're challenging friends and neighbors. But finding those relationships where they can provide security and belonging will really help them build those skills of resilience. Okay, so if we really want to help improve health and safety for ourselves and for future generations, then we have to have thriving communities. And so helping build thriving communities is so important, and it's really about empowerment. And so we have to empower the people within the community, within the school, within our neighborhoods, just within our communities, to lead within the community. And y'all know about this. I mean, y'all are a community yourselves as the PTSO. And so we have to invest in our community capacity. And part of that investment is we can provide education about ACEs and neurobiology. So what we're doing right now, that's why Tiffany and I are like so passionate about getting this out to as many people as possible, because we can then all have a common language where, we're able to understand that, our neighbor or this person that we're interacting with might have something that has gone on in their lives that's contributing to, how they're behaving. So, but building community capacity, really, we have to help people learn, first of all, but then we have to help them build the skills that they need to contribute to the community. So, I think we're gonna, in future slides, we're gonna talk a little bit about building community processes, but really it's being able to leverage the resources within that community, and then helping people lead within that community helps foster these thriving communities. I think we're back over to you, Tiffany.
Yeah, there are 16 slides left. I want to solicit your feedback. I'm not trying to be up here till 9 o'clock, just being completely honest. So I can speed through, or we can just end here. You all have to let me know in the chat what you're thinking. In the meantime, I'll talk and then let me know what you're thinking. So these are 4 resilience factors that tend to make a difference in ACEs. So like I said in the chat, it's not an all or nothing concept. I don't want you to believe that because your child or you experienced a lot of ACEs, that means that you're doomed. So I'm going to skip that. I'll go over this real quickly. So something to consider when we look at these next few slides, because these next few slides are graphs, is that we're looking at people who feel emotionally and socially supported and hopeful with people who rarely feel supported. So you'll see here that when there is when you have a person who experiences low support and hope, plus they have high ACEs, they tend to be more of a smoker. So the higher the ACE score, the less support they feel, the more likely they are to smoke. And then when you see that someone experiences a lot of support and hope, then their potential for smoking goes down. So you have ACEs, but then when you add in, so you have ACEs, nature, nurture, all of that stuff going on, but then when you add in support, it tends to mitigate the effects of those ACEs. So the same can be true here for mental health. The higher the ACEs, the higher the risk of poor mental health when there is low support and hope. But then when there is a high level of support and hope, the mental health issues tend to go down. So we'll see the same thing for help when someone feels like they have 2 or more concrete people in person who can help them. So the trend is the same. When there is low help and high ACEs, the community experiences a higher population of people who go hungry, because the idea is that if you have, a group of people in your community, they're more than likely going to give you some food. So that ends up being the case here. When someone experiences help from others, despite their ACEs, they are less likely to go hungry. I did a good job speeding through. Elizabeth, you're a go. We're almost done, y'all.
That is the fastest you've ever done that. Okay, so back to building community resilience. So one of the ways to do that, well, Tiffany's kind of already talked about it a little bit through those graphs, but community reciprocity, really that's having each other's backs. So looking out for each other, checking on your neighbor. Honestly, like, I feel weird to say this, but I grew up in Alabama, and so we like lived in the middle of nowhere, and I didn't really have neighbors. So this is one of my first experiences, like really having neighbors and being involved with my neighbors. But it's like the coolest thing, but also like brings a level of responsibility, right? Because I've got some older neighbors that I check in with, and we've been able to help out for several things. And so it's amazing to have that. And so when that is like low in a community, it's not good. So building that community reciprocity is really important. And then social bridging, that's just the idea of being able to reach outside of the immediate circle within the community and bring in the resources that are necessary. Because we were talking about like building the leadership and building the capacity, but sometimes we have to recognize when we have to bring in, skills or resources from outside. And so when we have higher rates of reciprocity and bridging, then we have better rates of these different things. So people are happier, people are less likely to go hungry, like Tiffany was saying. People are less likely to worry about money, less alcohol consumption, less mental illness symptoms. So, having neighbors who care about one another does a whole lot of good things. Okay, sorry. Okay, so I don't want to beat a dead horse here, but talking about community capacity and building that, we were talking earlier about gaining more information and having a common language. And so, you need to expand leadership and like have that shared learning. So you have that common language so that you can create results and you can create programs that are effective for that particular community. So just following some of these steps to develop that community capacity is so important. So building communities that respect cultural traditions and values is a really important activity for all of us. And just like the rising tide lifts all boats, a high capacity community lifts all beings. So people living in high capacity communities are less likely to have adverse childhood experience, or they're less likely to have adverse childhood experience scores. And they are less likely to have high rates of drug and alcohol abuse in that community. There's less depression in the community, less serious mental illness, and fewer problems at school and work. So that is kind of our, our call to action is to, help us build a community that is high capacity so that we can lower some of these ACE scores and help some of these things in our community. So there's a predictable pattern to transformative change, and it begins with discovery and communication. And that often leads people to clarify their values and their thinking. So with new knowledge and new habits of thinking, people can change the actions they take in everyday life. So the collective actions of many people shape a new reality. And it's small changes, like I was saying. It's small changes like our thoughts, our conversations with others, the way we relate to other people in relationships or in our families or in communities. So the change is up to us, and it doesn't have to be overwhelming because it's those, it's those small changes, like I was saying. You're on mute.
I caught myself. Thank y'all for coming and listening to our presentation, for letting us step in during your PTSO meeting. We hope that you were able to gain a new perspective about not just your child, but yourself, and then other people who you come in contact with. As parents and caretakers, you help them develop the neural connections of a positive view of self-efficacy, and connection with others. So be mindful of some of the words that you choose. I know that when I'm working with, I have like a good 1 or 2 handfuls of kids that I see like almost every single day or week. And I'm constantly trying to be mindful of the positive words that I give to them, because I know that they aren't necessarily the kids that experience a lot of affirmation. So I make sure that I pour it on thick when I can. So when you feel that it's fitting for yourself and for others, not just children, but adults too, pour it on thick, because we don't get that a lot in our society. So the goal here isn't necessarily to get our whole society to an A score of 0, but by simply bringing A scores down by any amount possible, we can definitely have huge impacts on our community. Because remember, it's not just about you. All these people walking around with ACEs are in our communities, our neighbors. So if you don't do it for yourself, do it. I mean, if you're not doing it for others, do it for yourself. There is a brief survey. If you have a second, go ahead, use that. When it says sponsoring CSB, it's Fairfax County. And if you all have any questions, we will feel free to answer that for you all.
Elizabeth, what school are you from again, please?
West Potomac.
Well, thank you guys so much. It was very informative, and I appreciate, you, Tiffany and Elizabeth, sharing your knowledge with us. And Tiffany, we'll see you again in April, and I'll be in touch.